Welcome to tonight's event, The Last Orca Captures a 50-Year Legacy. So glad you're joining us. I'm Stone Addington from Humanities Washington. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to open minds and bridge divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. While everyone participating in this event is joining from different places, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that Humanities Washington presents this program from the traditional and occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples. We ask those participating in this event, wherever they may be, to learn about and reflect on the lands they inhabit, acknowledging the ancestral and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. Tonight, we'll be exploring the last orca capture in Washington waters 50 years ago this month and its ripples throughout history. We're grateful to be joined by a remarkable panel who will share their expertise and perspectives on this pivotal chapter in our region's history and the many questions this anniversary raises. A couple of logistical notes before we dive in. If you'd like to use closed captioning, please click the More button at the bottom of your window and then Show Captions. Just be aware that the captions are automatically generated and may contain errors. Following this discussion, our panelists will respond to audience questions. You can submit questions at any point through the Q&A box. If you choose to submit a question, please note this event will be recorded, so your name may appear on the screen and in the recording. In addition to events like this one, Humanities Washington partners with organizations across the state to host hundreds of in-person and online programs throughout the year, from lectures to community conversations, to traditional arts apprenticeships, to reading programs for middle schoolers and their families. Visit our calendar at humanities.org to explore programs near you, like Power and Politics in the Age of AI, and Why Trust is Essential to Democracy. Programs like tonight's are made possible by the generosity of audience members like you. If you think conversations like these are important to our state, please consider making a gift at humanities.org. I'll put a link in the chat in just a moment. Your support helps bring these kinds of discussions to communities all across Washington state. So we have an incredible panel to explore our topic, so we should get to it. Leading us through tonight's conversations is Meena Silvakumar, Associate Teaching Professor in the Museology Graduate Program at the University of Washington. Meena, thank you so much for leading our conversation. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Stone, and thank you, Humanities Washington. Hello, everybody. I'm Meena Selvakumar. Stone has already introduced me. I teach at University of Washington, the Museology program, part of the Information School. My background is in public engagement and science communication, specifically in museums. There's so much we can say about the charismatic orca. But today we're keeping our focus on using the lens of the Budd Inlet capture, which happened 50 years ago. As Stone said, we had a dream panel for this topic today. What I will do is we'll do a brief introduction, and I really encourage audience members to check out Humanities Washington's website for a detailed bio and links to our panelists' work. It's phenomenal. Panelists, if you could please briefly introduce yourselves, share your name, how you wish to be addressed, and your connection to today's topic. I'll start with Skilahele, and we'll go from there.
Good evening. Thank you, Stone and Meena. Skilahele Senesnat, Raynell Morris, Senesnat, Chuck Lummy's son. My respected friends and relatives, I am an elder matriarch of the Lummi tribe, or Lactamish people, survivors of the Great Flood. My traditional name is Skilahele. My English name is Raynell Morris. I prefer to be called Skilahele, and the Lactamish people look at southern resident killer whales, orca, as Quethalmachin, which means our relatives that live under the waves. So what happens to them happens to us. Aishka, thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, Karen.
Yes, I am Karen Monroe Ellick. I worked in public relations and have been on various nonprofit boards, including Humanities Washington and the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Coalition. I was married to Ralph Monroe while he was Washington Secretary of State for 5 terms. We divorced later in life, but we remain good friends always.
Thank you, Karen. Howard?
Yes, my name is Howard Garrett. Thank you for the introduction. And I am co-founder with my wife Susan of Orca Network. We started in 2001, so it's our 25th year. And I'm also on the board of the Center for Whale Research, which began in that same year as that capture in 1876. So it's the 50th year of the Center for Whale Research.
Thank you, Howard. And Jason?
Hey there, great to be here. My name is Jason Colby. I'm a professor of international and environmental history at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island in BC, but grew up in Puget Sound, especially on Bainbridge Island. And I guess my reason for being invited to the panel is I'm the author of the book Orca: How We Came to Know and Love the Ocean's Greatest Predator, that came out in 2018.
Thank you all. So audience, our discussion will be in three parts, and we will follow that up with Q&A from the audience, from all of you. And so as you think of things, just pop them into the chat. So as we've been told, you've been told, this webinar is coming from the Puget Sound in Washington State, and the Budd Inlet is located in this region. So we will begin with some cultural, historical, and scientific context that's actually critical to this conversation. So our first part is actually going to be around that. Our region is also home to many coastal indigenous tribes and communities. Skilahele, will you please share the Lummi Nation's ancient cultural connections to these waters and orcas?
Aishka, the Lactamish people look at our finned, our winged, our two-legged, our four-legged, all as extensions of our family. And our specific connection with Scalicia, all of the southern resident killer whales, is when they captured Skelly Chucktonut in 1970. She was 4 years old. When we were told that that had happened, I went to our late chief, Salik, and asked him, and he said, what they did to Skelly Chucktonut is exactly what they did to our Indian children. When the churches and the government came and took the children, stripped them of their families, their language, their food, and their homes. He said that's exactly what they've done with her. And that breaks the ashakya, which is our word for the web of life. When you break or damage one strand in that web of life, it affects the whole. And he said, we need to bring her home. You bring her home and it'll help heal her family. It'll help heal our people. That's the close connection that we have with the relatives that live under the waves. And so we led a campaign to bring her home. And we talked to the Quathalmich and the Orcas, much like we do our own family and kin. When they're hungry, they're salmon people. We want to feed them. They specifically eat Chinook salmon. Lactamish people are salmon people. So the relationship is very close and we respect one another.
Thank you so much. It's just reminds me of that ancient tradition and cultural connection that remains unbroken. Jason, as you said, you wrote a book. It's a remarkable book. I read it. I finished reading it last week for the second time, actually, and it captures, hundreds of years of orcas. If you could share highlights up to the mid-1970s-ish that put the Pacific Northwest on the map and made us a turning point in the story. So taking parts of your book and helping us understand our role in Washington State.
Absolutely. I'm going to distill 400 pages and 300 pages into 5 minutes. I promise. So I will hit a few highlights and hopefully give you a nice little segue to Howard's story, which I think will be wonderful. So for centuries, it was the maritime industries like fishing and whaling that shaped views of killer whales around the world. And it was men, especially men, who worked the seas, who referred to them interchangeably as killers and as orcas. The orcas was actually a pretty old term. Writing in the 1870s, whaling skipper Charles Scammon called orcas, quote, marine beasts who spread terror and death to every ocean. Popular views of killer whales as man-eating pests actually grew after World War II. The US Navy, believe it or not, strafed orcas at the request of the government of Iceland to protect herring stocks. Diving manuals warned that they were deadly and divers should get out of the water. One diving guide, in fact, wrote, quote, "There is no treatment for being eaten by the orca except reincarnation." It was a quirk of geography, really, that made the Pacific Northwest a crucible of change. The region's population centers, they sit on Puget Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Strait of Georgia, a transborder marine ecosystem that we now call the Salish Sea. This was also, we later learned, the main range of what scientists would dub by the 1980s and 90s the southern resident killer whales, three pods, J, K, and L, that feed primarily on Chinook salmon. There may have been as many as 250 or 300 of them as late as the 1880s when industrial fishing started. But due to industrial fishing and damming of rivers that brought falling Chinook runs, as well as violence from fishermen who saw the orcas as threats, these numbers plummeted. Scientists also in the region viewed killer whales mostly as pests. Throughout the 1960s, in particular, researchers at Seattle's Marine Mammal Biological Laboratory killed orcas to study their stomach contents, and fishermen, both indigenous and settler, shot them frequently. Things went further on Vancouver Island, right close to where I'm sitting, where Canadian fisheries officials actually mounted a 50 caliber machine gun near Campbell River in 1961 to shoot orcas. But in the following years, live capture sparked a transformation. And it's strange to think because, of course, we look down upon it and we have real misgivings about it now. But it began by accident in 1964 when the Vancouver Aquarium harpooned and briefly held an orca in captivity. But it was really Puget Sound that was the epicenter of all this. In 1965, Ted Griffin displayed a captive orca named Namu at his Seattle Marine Aquarium, right close to where the ferry docks are. He became the first person that we know of to swim with an orca, published an article in National Geographic entitled "Making Friends with a Killer Whale." And that article, according to my own interviews, inspired a lot of future researchers who read it, including Howard's half-brother, Ken Balcom. But Namu's popularity had a dark side. He convinced other oceanariums around the world that they needed to acquire their own orcas as sort of a signature animal. And in the following years, Griffin and the Puget Sound fishermen he worked with supplied most of them. About 50 orcas, almost all of them southern residents, were removed from the region over a period of about 10 years, really about 7 years, including SeaWorld's first captive orca, Shamu, which was named as She Namu. Captive orcas gave most visitors their first close-up views of cetaceans, and scientists their first access to live killer whales. Remember, science at the time was of the kill and dissect variety. Among those who had this opportunity was Paul Spong, future pioneer of orca research. In this sense, I think it's useful to note that in the context of the times, and this is hard to imagine, capture was actually sort of progressive initially. After all, the debate wasn't between whale catching and whale watching initially, it was between whale catching and whale killing. But opposition to capture also emerged, especially in August 1970, about 6 years before the Budd Inlet capture, when Griffin's crew unknowingly trapped all three pods of southern residents in Penn Cove off of Whidbey Island. And there was no regulation against this. They could have actually removed the whole population if they wanted. Among the young whales removed was Lolita, who was sold to the Miami Seaquarium. These captures helped bring the first regulations, the first restrictions, first in Washington State in 1971, and then the Federal Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972. They also spurred the first research, especially by Canadian biologist Michael Bigg, who discovered how to identify individual orcas and eventually pods and relationships within them. I promise I'm wrapping up. In 1972, Griffin left his business or transferred his business to Tacoma-born partner Don Goldsberry, who hired on with SeaWorld. The San Diego-based company had just opened two new locations in Ohio and in Florida, and it needed a steady supply of its signature attraction. But over the next 4 years, 72 to 76, Goldsberry couldn't deliver for SeaWorld. Finally, in March 1976, he and the local fishermen he worked with corralled a group of orcas in Budd Inlet. No one knew it at the time, but these actually weren't residents. These were mammal-eating transients, or BIGS killer whales. They'd been captured nearly in view of the state capitol building, as well as luck would have it, right next to Evergreen State College, where an orca symposium was being held, believe it or not. The truth is often stranger than fiction. Thanks.
That's amazing. Thank you. That was fascinating. So we are at that 1976 capture right now. But right now, I'm going to ask you to put a pin in the story, which has been the intersection of people and orcas for a few minutes, and focus on just the orcas, what we know of their biology and their culture. Howard, you co-founded the Orca Network, and I was wondering if you could help us understand what we know about orcas.
Thank you, Mina. It's a fascinating story and it's still unfolding. There's no question that the display of performing orcas and the whole marine park industry improved the public's perception of orcas, um, because relative to what came before, to the killing of them, it was a vast improvement. And at the same time, as Jason pointed out, that sort of spurred some research efforts, first in Canada, and then my brother Ken in the U.S. To study them. And after that, field studies have slowly grown around the world. And now we know a whole lot more about what those animals really are like that were captured over that period. And I can illustrate some of that advance in knowledge by quoting a headline from the Seattle Times from March 27th, 2024, just 2 years ago. What you thought you knew about orcas might have been wrong. And that was about this controversy about whether we have more than one species of orca. Because since 1874, they've all been considered one species worldwide. But scientists decided there were at least two species, and those were the two that we have here. And I have to underline how remarkable it is that we have two completely different types of orcas that travel around in Puget Sound, in the Salish Sea. They are within range of each other all the time, and there's virtually no interaction between them, and they have been separated genetically for at least 300,000 years. So it's really an amazing sort of a natural laboratory that we have right here. But the question was what to call them. Are they separate species? Well, the taxonomy committee of the Society for Marine Mammalogy brought that question up, and by a very narrow vote, decided not to declare them separate species. And their worry was that even though it's pretty clear right here in the Salish Sea that we have two completely different types of orcas, what about worldwide? That opens a can of worms, because the field studies have shown that orcas inhabit every part of the world's oceans, and that's 71% of the surface of the earth. So they're everywhere, basically. And that in each location, there are different types of orcas with different diets, different traditions, different vocalizations that are, by all intents and purposes, the equivalent of language. And so how could they assign each one a separate species? So I think they just punted on that and said, no, let's just not do that right now. So that's what we're left with, is trying to figure out, okay, what are these cultural communities of orcas that are found everywhere, tropics, Arctic water, just everywhere in where there's oceans, you can find orcas. So we're only just beginning to become aware of the incredible sophistication, the cultural, the cognitive, the communicative capabilities of these whales. And as I say, they're everywhere. In fact, just to bring it up to the present moment, the news is today there are 4 completely different groups of big transient orcas in the Salish Sea. Orca Network has a whale sighting network, and so we get reports from all over the place, and hundreds, maybe thousands of people keep track of where all these whales are. And one thing that is especially mysterious and intriguing to me is that there is a group of 3 orcas that came from somewhere else that showed up in late February, first in Howe Sound, which is basically downtown Vancouver, and then down to Seattle, into Elliott Bay, close to the waterfront. And then they went to Tacoma, and then they went to Olympia, and everywhere in between. And they're still here just this afternoon. It's apparently a mother called 419. So we call them by their matriline, the mother and her family. So these are the 419s, the T419s. And they were in Elliott Bay today. And then they went down very close to shore around Alki Point, and they're meandering around, and one apparently a teenage son, and they're from somewhere else. They
Thank you,
weren't
Howard.
in any of the catalogs. And they seem to have different vocalizations. We haven't been able to get the DNA to know if they're from some mid-Pacific or North Pacific, but they have cookie cutter shark bites. And
Wow.
cookie cutter sharks only inhabit waters that are warm in the southern latitudes around Hawaii and Point South. So
Thanks,
they
Howard.
come to,
I'm going to move to
oh,
Karen, but I just want to summarize a couple of really important things that you said, which was that they have very distinct languages that they maintain. They're very social. They stick with their pods, and there's a
yes,
strong matriarchal bond over there that is important for, lifelong in especially in our southern residents.
that
Uh,
seems
and
universal.
right. And so they're highly, highly complex and exquisitely intelligent
Right.
creatures.
I
Karen,
get carried away.
uh, Karen, we are now in 1976, back where Jason left us. Karen, you have a unique perspective on that turning point. Can you please share your story of March 7th, 1976, please?
Yes, of course. Sunday, March 7th, 1976 was an unusually warm day in Olympia, Washington, and Ralph and I were going sailing with friends. Leaving the harbor, we saw a pod of orcas swimming fast and being chased by 2 large boats and a speedboat with a seaplane nearby. We realized it was the capture crew hired by SeaWorld, which had already taken 60 orcas, approximately 60 orcas, out of our Washington waters and sold them to marine parks from different places in the United States and even overseas. Our captain tried to get his boat between the orcas and the capture boats, but the men yelled at us and threatened us, saying, "We have permits and we're legal. Get out of here." The orcas tried to escape, but the seaplane taxied back and forth, and men on the speedboat were throwing explosives, small explosives, into the water. They drove the terrified animals into the shallow bay and threw nets around them. We were all upset, but wisely Ralph said, "We have to stay here. We can't stop them, but we must watch and see what they do and remember everything they do because it may be important later. So we watched the horrible scene as the men separated the young orcas, which they wanted, from their family members, prodding them with long poles and screaming at them. The anguished cries of the orcas were heartbreaking. The animals outside the nets did not leave. They kept circling around and calling to their captive relatives. We were very depressed heading back to shore. Ralph and I decided we should call our friends in the press. Early the next morning, he came in with a newspaper and yelled, "We've won round one. Mike Layton has written a great story and it's on page 1 of the Seattle PI." King TV came to Olympia that morning to film the orcas in the nets, and other news outlets followed. Soon it was a big news story, and crowds of protesters came to Olympia, upset about the theft of our orcas by SeaWorld. At this time, Ralph happened to be on Governor Dan Evans' staff, and he knew Attorney General Slade Gorton very well. He contacted Evans and Gorton, and they agreed that the situation needed to be investigated. Attorney General Gorton put 3 of his assistant AGs on the case, and they studied the lengthy permit to see if any provisions had been violated. They found one key provision that had been. The whales were to be allowed to swim naturally and not herded in a certain direction, and they were to be treated humanely. These requirements were not consistent with what we had seen. Washington State filed suit against SeaWorld on March 10th, 1976. The case was taken on an emergency basis because everyone was worried about the orcas being in the nets, and both sides presented arguments at the federal courthouse in Seattle. Many observers, all of them against SeaWorld as far as we could see, watched anxiously. The 6 of us from the sailboat submitted affidavits, as did many people who lived along Puget Sound between Tacoma and Olympia. They testified that they had seen a pod of orcas swimming fast, with boats chasing them. The legal arguments went on for several days. SeaWorld had an army of lawyers and public relations people there. Once it seemed we had triumphed, but they won an appeal and things continued. However, SeaWorld personnel were becoming concerned about their public image. Some negative information was coming out about previous captures, including the drowning of 4 orcas, which they had tried to cover up. Finally, on March 23rd, SeaWorld signed an agreement that they would release the orcas and never capture orcas in our waters again. The courtroom erupted with joy.
Wow, thank you so much, Karen. That's actually such a riveting story, and Washington gets a redemption arc of sorts, being the waters where the first orcas were captured, and then the first state, right, to completely ban their capture. Again, after public action and public outcry. So this brings us to our part 2, where this was 50 years ago. And so to a reflection of the past 50 years and the legacy of that Budd Inlet capture. So I'm going to ask the panelists to keep their remarks in 2 to 3 minutes. Jason, let's start with a broad perspective. What have been some of these changes in public perception since the mid-70s?
Yeah, another big question. I'll try to be fast. I think about the Budd Inlet capture not so much as a transformation in how people saw orcas, because I think that one of the reasons there was such an outpouring of support for the case in opposition to SeaWorld is because that transformation had already taken place. But I do think about it as a key moment in how the people of Puget Sound and the Washington state government, and certainly the people of Western Washington, took on a sense of new stewardship of the place and the waters and the resources and orcas certainly. And I think Karen and I think Ralph are amazing examples of that. Because remember that this is a transformation within the state itself. I mean, at the time, people thought of this as SeaWorld coming in and taking our whales, but in fact, SeaWorld had never, not once, directly taken whales out of Washington state. It had always been actually fishermen and entrepreneurs in Washington state who had done it. But this is a key moment when I think that the people of Washington State and the government start thinking about it as they can't come and take our whales, they can't come and take our resources, and this is actually part of a bigger surge in the West and certainly in Washington State of taking ownership and control from the federal government of resources. But I also want to mention that this doesn't end captures. Certainly doesn't end violence toward orcas. And in fact, it shows while it shows how much things have changed in Washington State, that there's opposition even to capture while there's whaling still going on, in the oceans. That transformation hadn't happened everywhere, and I'll just flag an example here. I mean, in 1980, the Soviet Union alone reported that it had killed 916 orcas in that year's Antarctic hunt, 141 of whom were females that were pregnant. And so
Hmm.
there's still this kind of ghastly violence going on. But what made Budd Inlet so important, I think, is it happens in the public eye in inner waters, and it shows how values are changing, right? I mean, that there's this fascinating clash in a sense between fishermen who were extractive workers, right? They're used to taking salmon out. They saw orcas as resources to extract. And you have people, certainly like Karen and Ralph, who are representing what I would say is a changing set of values toward the region and toward its resources. And it finds expression in Dan Evans's government through Slade Gordon's lawsuit that I think is really powerful. And just the last couple points. Um, Capture wasn't banned in Washington State because Washington State didn't have the power to do it. It was a federal matter. But SeaWorld agreed to leave. It went to Iceland to capture orcas successfully. Then it tried to get permits to capture them in Alaska. But one of the things it didn't count on is that people like Karen and Ralph had become so engaged in this issue that they essentially chased SeaWorld to the ends of the earth, even cooperating with officials in Alaska to try to stop those captures. And so the I would say that the Budd Inlet capture galvanized a lot of people around environmental questions, around orcas, because of it being such a scene of violence that it really sort of politicized people about that. And hopefully I'm not putting words in Karen's mouth, but I often think about that as being a really signal moment for that.
Mhm.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks for some of those clarifications as well. And it's important to also consider that there was a broader environmental act in the background starting in the 60s and 70s about being stewards of the environment, a better connection to our ecology. So these things are not happening in silos, but it's always about, broader action and public sentiment that changes things. So perhaps this is a good time to go back to one story. Skilehele, you and your community, as you described earlier, were activated around one orca, Scully Cheltenot, also called Tokite, Toki, Lolita. Can you please share her story and what that story has meant for your community?
Well, once the Lummi tribe learned of her capture and that she was from the L pod and was in fact our relative and being sold to Miami Sea Aquarium, where she joined Hugo, who had been captured from the same waters and from the same pod, the L pod. And finding out after 12 years, Hugo never adjusted to captivity and committed suicide. He rammed and rammed and rammed his head against the tank until he had a brain hemorrhage, and she witnessed that. So when we were able to look at what happened to her, how it affected her family, and the fact is we believe Ocean Sun L25 is her mother and is still alive and is 100 years old and is leading her people. She is the matriarch of Scalicia, all of the southern resident killer whales. It just really became what our late chief Salik said. We have to return her to her family. And we look at what the capture era had done to her family and how many generations were stolen through that. And so I was asked to lead the campaign to bring her home. And she had been at Miami Seaquarium for a number of years, and many other groups, PETA and many, many others that loved her and wanted her return, fought for her release. But it wasn't until the Lactamish people took the lead in the campaign to say, that's our relative. And in working with the current owner, Eduardo Albor from Miami Seaquarium, the dolphin company, to explain to him why that's our relative and why it's important for her to return home. And that began that dialogue and the formation of a nonprofit to give her her own personal vet, to do the work within the federal agencies that retired her. She was no longer to be revenue generating, selling tickets and performing for her food. And so she was retired. And through this nonprofit, I was able to go in and do 7 ceremonial healings to heal her spirit. We had two top-notch world vets just for her, healing her body. But Salik, our chief, said her spirit is sick. Her spirit needs to be healed. And he taught me how to do ceremony for her to help heal her spirit. She and I developed a very close bond. I was the only one in her family that she had ever met in all those years of captivity, 50 plus years. I was able to share the story of her family, her upbringing, her waters, who I was, how we're related, drumming to her, talking about her family songs and my people's songs, and our desire to get her well enough to come home. And so she was working on her spirit. She was understanding who she was and where she was from. And our people began to understand the importance of when our family members are stolen and when they're starving and when they're being beaten and mistreated, that we have an obligation to take care of them, no matter how far away they are. And my understanding is this is the first time Indigenous peoples had ever raised this challenge to a corporation, to an owner, that this is our relative, this is our family. You need to help us understand why you've done this and how you can help return her to her people, to her waters. And so this is the first of this. And captivity did so many awful things, not only to her, but to all the marine mammals that are in captivity around the world. And she was the one that brought awareness because of who she was, how many people around the globe knew her, knew of her, knew her story. And in the end of it is she helped close that park. Her sacrifices, her love, her awareness helped close that park. They are closed. Miami Seaquarium is closed. Good. That was Skelly Chuktanut sacrifices. And we owe it to her. And the work is, that should be done with all the marine parks around the world. It's not education. It's not humane. We owe her a lot. And we're grateful for her. And now we have to fight for her family. They're hungry.
Thank you. Thank you, Skelehele. And I think many of us who live here know that in 2023, after she was supposed to be released and come home, and she was supposed to return just a few months before that, unfortunately, she died in Miami. And the Lami Nation had a ceremony after she came home. Now, that brings us to Howard, because you were also very involved in her return, in Toki's return. through the work of Orca Network. I was wondering if you could speak very briefly, Howard, about other actions of the Orca Network that you've been working that they've been working on.
Sure. First, we're forever grateful to Squilahila for bringing Skalichaktinat peace and family love, and I think it improved her life so much. Well, yes, the campaign actually started. There was an interesting historical tidbit. March 9th, 1995, at the Daybreak Star Center in Seattle, when my brother Ken Balcom and Ralph Monroe and Governor Mike Lowry announced the start of the campaign to bring her home to rejoin LPOD. It was a long, and we knew it was against all odds, but we came that close, as Squilahila has mentioned. But we have instituted a new effort from Orca Network called Toki's Legacy, and that is to both bring out the wonders of orcas, the natural history, the incredible capabilities of orcas, and to work for her family, for the southern residents. They are starving episodically. The gestation is a year and a half, and so the mothers to be need to eat for two in that entire time, and so they're needing a steady supply of calorie-rich big salmon. King Chinook salmon is by far their preference. And if they don't have that on a regular basis, they'll go hundreds of miles to find it, but they've got to find it. And so their reproductive rate, the losses before birth and in the first year of the newborn's life are drastic. About 2/3 don't make it. So that is what is holding the whole population down. It's plateaued in the last 6 or 7 years in the low to mid 70s. It's at about 76 right now, but they need salmon, and that means habitat restoration. It means rivers, it means wetlands, it means shorelines, it means access to spawning grounds and improved conditions in all of those places. So, and that is being done in a lot of ways, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. They will make it if they have the fish. No fish, no blackfish is the way the saying goes.
Thank you, Howard. And as you mentioned earlier, our southern residents predominantly eat Chinook salmon, king salmon. So
That's right.
And that's a declining population. So there is a lot of concern. Karen, I'd like to bring us back full circle to Budd Inlet. To commemorate that 50th anniversary, you were recently invited to speak to the Olympia City Council. Could you share a little bit, give us a behind the scenes of what that was like and what that meant for you?
Yes, it was a meaningful time. The Olympia City Council passed a proclamation commemorating this capture and the fact that it was the last capture of orcas in United States waters. This was partly because of the bill that Senator Magnuson put through Congress to make it impossible for them to capture whales in other places, although, as people have said, Puget Sound and the Canadian waters are really the place where they wanted to capture orcas anyway, because the geographic situation was better there. So I spoke to the council. It was kind of interesting because many of the council members and the mayor himself did not live in Olympia at that time, so they really didn't know much about this. And some of them probably weren't even born 50 years ago. I'm sure they weren't. But they were very interested and felt that they had learned a piece of history that is important to Olympia itself and to our state. So that was meaningful. The other thing that happened because of this Orca symposium going on at the Evergreen State College was that the people who were attending that symposium, of course, came down to the harbor and wanted to see what was going on and wanted to do what they could. They ended up talking to a lot of the press people who were also down there writing stories about this. And I think as a result of that, when the news stories came out, they not only told about the capture and how bad it was, but they put out a lot of information, very valid information about orcas and what they're like and their intelligence and their family connections. And so people, I think, learned more about orcas than they would have had this symposium not by chance been going on at that very time.
Thank you, Karen. It strikes me that so much of the story has been about how we, the Orca story has been about how we see ourselves, starting from, wanting to control nature through all of the killing of orcas and hundreds of years ago, to seeing ourselves as benevolent in some way, but now kind of maybe seeing ourselves as part of a larger ecosystem. So it seems to also be a reflection of our own human ego through time. So I want to close this. Again, we'll keep this very brief. I just want us to imagine that future in your eyes, this 50th anniversary. What should it prompt us to consider for what we owe this shared environment? And if you could share one hope in like one phrase or one sentence, one hope, one action or message, which you believe that can also engage the broad public, because as we see, it is always broad public action that makes things happen. So let's keep that brief, and let's start with Skillehere.
I can do that absolutely, Mina. It's breach the 4 lower Snake River dams. They must come down. That's the quickest way to get food to our finned relatives, the Quethalmachan. It has to happen soon. In order to save Quethalmachan, save the salmon, they're also on the endangered species list.
And this is because our southern residents rely on Chinook salmon, and the dams prevent that migration back home to spawn. Karen, if you could share a message.
Well, as I think about what brought about the success and why we were able to defeat SeaWorld basically in this court case, it was because people were upset and very concerned about the whole situation of the capture. And they showed up. They came to the protest at the harbor. They protested at the state capitol. They protested in Olympia. And I think that it was people's concern and their actions. The people who lived along the shoreline between Tacoma and Olympia came in on their own volition to sign affidavits saying what they had seen because they felt it was wrong. And, we didn't ask them to do that. They just showed up. And so I think it's important for all of us to remember that when there's an issue that is really important with the environment or with other issues, we have to show up and we have to speak out, maybe meet with elected representatives, write letters, but showing up and talking to people in the congressional offices and, let them know that we're concerned, because that, I think, is what made the success happen.
Yeah, for sure. Show up and also listen to other points of view, right? To sort of like find common ground.
And register to vote and vote.
Yes.
Yeah.
Howard, briefly, and then we'll end with Jason.
Right. Well, first I want to underline what Squealy Hilla said about the four Snake River dams. They need to be removed so that the orcas will have enough to eat so they can bring healthy babies into the world. But for just one hopeful message, I would say follow the orca magic. I see it happening so many times, and it happens with me even after all these years. It doesn't let up, but I hear and I see people all the time when they see whales, when they see orcas especially coming by. It changes them. They become more optimistic, more communicative. They want to share their stories, their photos, and that spirit, I think, will lead to people showing up and voting and doing what needs to be done to help protect the orcas.
Thank you. I take the ferry quite often, a couple times a month for the past 5 years, and I've only seen the orcas once. But when it happened, the ferry slowed and everybody rushed to look, and it was just silent and awe, and that one far sight was enough to satiate me for quite a while. Jason.
Yeah, I actually want to say really briefly, I want to point once again to Howard's half brother as sort of an example of hopefulness, Ken Balcom, who we
Yeah.
lost just 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago, I think. So Ken was an amazing story. He started off as sort of the standard marine mammologist. He, in fact, I don't think he would like to talk about this very much, but he started off on those whaling boats, working with the biologists who were, killing, including orcas, killing whales and studying them that way, in 1966, 1967. And 10 years later, as a result of the Budd Inlet capture, Ken got his first government contract to launch an orca census in Washington State. And he worked with him, Rick Chandler, and others. And that was the initiation of a really extraordinary career of Ken's, not just founding the Center for Whale Research, but being a really powerful, articulate advocate for something that several of us have spoken about, which is food. Animals can deal with noise, they can deal with sickness, they can even deal with a certain level of violence and harassment if they have enough to eat. They cannot do any of these things. They certainly can't reproduce and thrive without food. And it's important to remember that the northern residents, not the southern residents, the northern residents who also suffered tremendously from human violence, not necessarily as much capture, but violence, have recovered to extraordinary numbers now.
Mm.
Maybe even they might even be out competing the southern residents to some degree for some Chinook runs. The southern residents continue to struggle, and the best we can tell is that they live in what we could only call, if we're being honest, an urban lake. A place where the human population has boomed. We've emptied out a lot of the ecological richness, certainly in the Salish Sea. I mean, people who move here like to think about it as a place of, sort of pristine wilderness. But of course, of us that have lived here know that it's quite depleted. And you go to a place like Pike Place Market, and you're like, wow, look at all the seafood. Well, it's almost all from Alaska. It's not from Washington State. And southern residents ranged from Northern California, the Sacramento Chinook runs, all the way up to Campbell River. And the fact that we have remade and depleted and denuded these river watersheds have limited not just their food, but I think their flexibility amidst climate change, and variability when they used to be able to go to certain places when they sort of reliably needed food. And we've changed the environment so quickly in kind of ecological terms, so quickly that the matriarchs that lead their pods, their rich knowledge is wrong to a degree because of how quickly we've changed nature. And so this is so my sort of my plea here is for us to remember, Ken's call for the need for more salmon. And so I would second the call to, any dams that are not central to power generation need to come down. And we've seen that when they do, at least in small scales, like the Elwha, the Elwha healed. And so I like to tell everybody who will ever listen to me, don't be hopeless about nature. A lot of young people are being sort of have the doom and gloom constantly. Nature can heal if you give it space and time, and we've seen examples of that. And so I would say, never give in to hopelessness, and never forget the obligation we have, certainly to a group of animals, the Southern residents, who helped us become better, helped transform us for the better.
That was a beautiful way to end this discussion, because that's what they did. Thank you so much for this rich discussion. Now, I'm sure our audience has questions, so I'm going to pass it on to Stone to send us questions. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been fantastic to listen to. We have lots of questions. We have a couple people asking about whale watching. Deborah Westwood says, do you have thoughts slash opinions on the whale watching industry? On the one hand, whale watch boats allow people to see the orcas and experience orca magic, but even with current guidelines on distances, etc., doesn't the presence of boats add stress on an endangered group?
I'd like to weigh in if I can, Stone. With the late Chief Salik, we went out and did ceremony with live Chinook out in the Salish Sea. And one of the times we were out there, there had to been a call that they saw the pod of orcas that were there. And with nanoseconds, there were over 40 whale watching boats surrounding the pod. They're not supposed to do that. And the way the orcas socialize and talk and communicate and hunt is acoustically. Noise travels 10 miles underwater. So even with Washington State's requirements for whale watching to be, so many feet back, that noise still travels, and it does interfere with their ability to hunt and to socialize with one another. So I say, watch from the land. Don't attribute. It's just like aquariums. Don't buy a ticket to go watch. Don't buy a ticket to go on a whale watching boat. Watch from the land. Cue into Orca Network. They'll give you a lot of information.
I'll disagree slightly about that, although I totally agree that this needs to be strictly regulated, and when it delves into harassment, it's totally it's absolutely unacceptable. There are places all over the world, certainly in Baja, where precious whale habitat would have been decimated without the whaling industry bringing people's eyes to the place. The salt industry would have, for example, destroyed gray whale calving lagoons. Having said that, I mean, it's a really hard question of how to do this. I mean, I agree that from the land, whale watching is always the best option. We also have to think, though, politically and culturally, for people that live on the coast and they have opportunistic, chances to see whales. It's great. It's great to be non-invasive and to watch from the land. But the real challenge is, how do you get someone in Minneapolis or Nebraska or South Carolina to care about whales and orcas? And it can be a really powerful and transformative and emotionally kind of exuberant experience to see whales in person, that actually several people on the panel have articulated really well. And you know, I I find myself really skeptical that you can have that same experience by watching even the best documentaries. It's funny, we say we want children to be more invested in nature, but we don't want to do that by sitting them in front of a YouTube video, right? And so it is a really hard question how you get people to be invested. But remember that some of the most outspoken, creative, and dynamic advocates for orcas are ones that either saw them in captivity in the 1960s and 70s, Michael Bigg, Ken Balcom, Paul Spong, go on. You don't have any of these people without their initial experiences with orcas, but also, many that go on to want to become whale researchers after seeing whales in person as kids. So I think it's easy to forget about that, but I totally share the concerns. I mean, you can't have disruptions like that. But I would also add things like, naval sonar are in some ways, even more vastly more disruptive and dangerous in enclosed waters like Puget Sound. Thanks.
Well, I don't have a whole lot to add because Squilahila and Jason have really covered that topic very well. All I would say is it it is so rewarding and enriching to see whales, even from a boat, that I hate to say no more. Although the current circumstances that whale watch boats don't come near southern residents. I mean, the distance has been prohibitive for even coming close, but it can be done with acute awareness that sound is disruptive. And if the boats go slow, if they tiptoe around the whales, if they don't try to get too close, but just within sight, and if the whales want to come to them, that's a great thing, but they don't have to get anywhere near them really to see them and appreciate them with a good narration on board, with good information. So that would be, the mitigation is just go very, very slow, and that reduces the sound output dramatically to a very small fraction of what it is when they're just steaming by.
Excellent. Let's move on to a question from John Jewell. Said, thank you so much for this fantastic webinar. How do you believe that practically losing an entire generation to the captures affected the southern resident pods and their culture? And we have a few questions about sort of cultural and behavioral aspects of Orca, which you spoke about, Howard. So I think people are interested both more generally about Orca culture as an idea and also how the captures affected them.
Well, it did take out a cohort, a whole generation of the southern residents for sure. But as to how it affected them, of course, they we don't know how to talk to them to get their opinion about that. But an amazing occurrence happened November 4th of 2024 when LPOD returned to Penn Cove for the first time since the captures. So more than 50 years later, and the only member of LPOD who was alive during the captures was L-25 Ocean Sun. And she seemed to be bringing the rest of LPOD in to the scene of that tragedy, of that trauma. And they were very tentative about it. They turned around. They were completely silent. They spy hopped a lot to see what was around. In fact, they came in halfway the first day. The second day, they came to the actual scene where the capture corrals had been set up, where the babies had been lassoed and lashed onto the side of the boats and held for deals to be made around the world to sell them. And they paced for, we don't even know how long. It went on until dark, and it was a windy night. And so there's no telling how long they stayed there. But for at least an hour and a half, they paced back and forth on exactly the site of where that capture happened. That tells me it left a deep, deep memory of the trauma and the tragedy, and that Ocean Sun was telling her family about that. And they whether it was a ritual, a ceremony, or just an outpouring, I don't know, but the coincidence just can't be denied that it was exactly where the captures happened. So it left a deep, deep traumatic memory for the whales. That I can attest.
I'll
I
just
agree that we believe that it was a ceremony that at 100+ years old, Ocean Sun was leading her people back there, and that during the ceremony, It's what we do. You can cleanse and you can give respect to those that were lost during that time period. And as she's getting ready to walk with ancestors, that leaves another area for her people to hunt if there's food there.
I'll just add really quickly that there's no doubt that these are already really small populations that were already decimated, probably almost certainly by human violence before the capture started, and the captures removed young animals. Of course, no one at the time knew these were small, pods that were, very, very vulnerable to this. And they are prior to that, they were already dealing with, now we now know, inbreeding issues and sort of lack of genetic diversity problems. It's even though the last southern resident wasn't taken into captivity, was taken into captivity in 1973. That's the last time one was removed for a captivity. It's almost certain that those removals reduced their resilience to their reproductive resilience, their ability to sort of replenish generations. As often happens with animals and human, impact and violence, we don't know the damage we've done until long after the fact, right?
Question for you, Jason. Can you talk more about how your family history impacted your career and perspective on this issue?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't have time to go into this, but my father is the only figure that I know of in this story who actually worked on both sides of the border for whale captors, and spent the whole time. This all happened before I was born. Spent the whole time as I was growing up trying to wrestle with the shifting meaning and the growing, I don't want to call it trauma because people overuse that word now, but certainly guilt about that history as the meaning of those things changed, right? I mean, as orcas became a sacred animal in lots of ways, and iconic to the rising environmental values of the Northwest. Um, and I would say that my process of researching and writing the book, this wasn't my intention, but I think gave him some peace about it. I certainly was trying to help different generations of Northwesterners understand one another. Because, there was, as I said, when Ted Griffin was going about his business, people were appalled not because he was trying to make friends with a killer whale, but because he was going to get into the water and get eaten on the waterfront is the sort of the main concern that public authorities had. And so we have experienced, this is really before I was born in 74, so a lot of this had taken place before this, but we've experienced, when it comes to our relationship with this animal, a transformation so rapid and profound in the region that we forgot it happened at all. And so we tend to, from our perspective now, look back and say, like, how could they have been so awful that they were doing that? You know, not realizing, for example, that the whaling was still going on, right, on the high seas. And so um the I guess the last thing I'll say is that for me, it was about a degree of healing for that history and finding peace about the role that human relationship with orcas has in the new Northwest, as I call it. The Northwest that thinks about the environment not just as a place for extraction, but as a place to foster and steward the creatures that share it with us.
Excellent. Well, Mina, do we have time for one more question, or should we move to closing thoughts?
I think we might have time for one short question.
Yeah, we have lots of, I should say, we have lots of great audience questions. We've had very close to 300 people show up tonight. So we're so grateful for our audience and the amazing questions you all are asking. Blame me for not getting to all of these great ones. A lot of folks are asking about essentially like what we can do. Many of you have mentioned reasons for hope and small actions we can take as individuals. But thinking back to the Budd Inlet capture itself and this 50 years we're looking back on, is there something we can do to make this story more well known back on people's minds? And are there any recent reasons for hope that we can end our conversation on? Because I know there have been some tears in the audience. I've gotten some text messages to that effect. So, in other words, what can we do to make sure people know this story? And what's a bit of hope we can end on?
This is going to sound dark at first, but it's going to be hopeful. So bear with me. I'll be really fast. In the summer of 2018, many of you remember this. Other Southern resident, Tahlequah, ended up raising or gaining public attention, not just in Western Washington, but around the world, for essentially this vigil she held for her dead calf. And now no one knows, what exactly was going on in her mind. Of course, we can't speak to her, but she had a calf that had either been stillborn or had died very quickly after birth. And in what seemed in a very human way, like grieving, she swam around with the calf's body, unwilling to let it go. And, it became, even if it wasn't intended, of course, as such in her mind, it became a political act in the sense that people in Puget Sound, people in the Pacific coast of North America, but also people as far away as India and Australia, Germany, there were headlines about this. And I think that, my perception of that at the time, following it very closely, is that it turned into actually in some ways a very powerful and eventually hopeful story, in the sense that not only did people start asking these questions of, what can we do to help make sure that Southern residents aren't starving, tearing down dams. I didn't mention this, but no sports fishing for juvenile blackmouth, Chinook salmon would be, basically banning sports fishing of Chinook salmon in these areas would be essential. But the hopeful part is this, that she went on to have a healthy calf. And this has happened before with others, other orcas that have been injured or rescued and such. And so I'll just say again, there's hope. There's always hope, even in tragedy and even in anxiety.
Well, I'm kind of a person who's worked in government and worked in political circles quite a lot. And I'm thinking maybe there's a way to use this story and what has happened, and especially what the captures have done to the population, as you were both discussing very eloquently, what the results were. Maybe there's a way to bring the public to a bigger awareness of what might be done, and then to try to influence the people who have the deciding powers about the Snake River dams and all. Maybe try to get a bigger lobbying effort going to help the orcas by getting more salmon into the areas. Is that feasible? Or maybe working even with the Department of Education at the state level to try to have some curriculum materials that would talk about orcas and would help the kids, who would then tell their parents, we need to get the orcas more food. I'm just thinking if more people were aware, maybe that would be productive.
Absolutely. Well, I'd say that was Ken's main message from the mid-90s, when the population of Southern residents dropped 20% over 5 years. that we have to do that. We have to bring back salmon in every way possible. And I think that message is out there. It needs to be reinforced and put into educational programs and no let up. But most people who are informed about orcas know that they need salmon first and
Mhm.
foremost. So I
Mhm.
think that message is out there, but it needs to be reinforced and spread wider. And because there's so many things that need to be done, many things are being done or have been done, but more needs to be done. So that's basically the message. And I think it's out there. It just needs to be reinforced.
Mhm.
I
Good.
would just like to add, Karen, that's a great lead in. We had Children of Setting Sun Productions, and the work that I've done with Resident Orca, the documentary on Skelly Chucktonut's life, is the Bellingham school districts do have a curriculum that they show third, fourth, and seventh graders for the last 4 years. And that's a real beginning to teach our young people about it. Resident Orca is streaming on Crave across Canada. 2 months ago, we just released a 12th grade and higher full curriculum from Resident Orca to teach, the older students about, with
Mhm.
all mention about orcas. And so getting it more broadly widespread curriculum's a good way. The other is just to have people watch what's happening with the administration when they're trying to make changes to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, when they're
Yeah.
trying to make changes to the Clean Water Act, when they're trying to do anything that doesn't help with salmon restoration, in our
Mhm.
watersheds. And I think there's a lot people can do. But I appreciate the question and everyone's response. Aishka.
Thank you all. And Humanities Washington is doing its part by having this conversation and disseminating it. And thank you, Stone, for bringing us together. Thank you, Humanities Washington. Thank you, panelists. It was so um, informative and enlightening to hear from all of you.
And thank you, Mina. What
Thank you.
fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for leading us. Thank you to our panelists. I can't imagine a better conversation on this topic. So grateful for you all. And we will send out an email to all of our audience members with links to books, podcasts, more resources, and especially the stellar work of our panelists, including Resident Orca and the curriculum you mentioned, as well as an audience survey. One last reminder, please do consider donating to Humanities Washington so that conversations like this can continue both online and in person across our state. Finally, one last thanks to our fantastic, fantastic panel. Thank you to our wonderful audience for being here tonight. And to everyone, thank you and have a lovely night. We'll see you soon around Washington State. Thanks all.
Thank you.